Margaret Vale made the greatest gamble of her life when she answered a mail-order bride advertisement from a Montana rancher she had never met. But nothing could have prepared her for the reality of John Rowan. A man so scarred by grief, he seemed to have forgotten how to speak from the heart. Trapped together in a blizzard that threatened to bury them, she would soon discover that the deepest truths are often hidden in silence, and that some storms heal what they cannot destroy. The train's whistle cut through the December air like a mourner's cry, announcing Margaret's arrival at the very edge of civilization. She pressed a gloved hand to the frosted windowpane, watching the sparse buildings of Copper Falls, Montana territory, materialize from the deepening dusk. The year was 1884, and she had traveled over 2,000 miles to marry a man whose face she had never seen, whose voice she had never heard, whose heart remained a complete mystery, locked away behind three concisely written letters. The conductor, a grizzled man with kind eyes and a tobacco-stained beard, stopped by her seat. "Copper Falls, Miss Vale? Though I confess, I wish it weren't." Margaret turned from the window, her green eyes questioning. "I don't understand." He gestured to the world beyond the glass. "A storm's coming. I can smell it in the air, feel it in my bones. This will be the last train through here for days, maybe weeks. Are you certain about this? You could ride on to Helena, wait it out in comfort." She thought of the boarding house room she'd left behind in Philadelphia, with its peeling wallpaper and the constant smell of boiled cabbage. She thought of Mrs. Henderson's dress shop, where she had spent 6 years sewing wedding gowns for other women, while her own prospects withered like autumn leaves. She thought of the pitying glances from the church ladies, the whispered conversations that ceased when she entered a room, the crushing weight of being 28 and unmarried in a city that had no use for spinsters. "I'm certain," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "Mr. Rowan is expecting me." The conductor nodded slowly, resignation on his weathered face. "John Rowan's a good man. Quiet as a stone, but decent. He'll keep you safe, if nothing else." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "Be patient with him, miss. He has his reasons for being quiet." Before Margaret could ask what he meant, the train jolted to a halt. The conductor shouldered her trunk with a grunt, and Margaret gathered her carpet bag and the small hatbox that contained her mother's wedding veil, the only thing of value she had brought from her old life. The platform, if it could be called that, was little more than a stretch of snow-dusted timber. A few buildings huddled against the wind, a general store, a saloon with a crooked sign, and a church so small it could have been a child's playhouse. A few bundled figures hurried about their business, heads bowed against the rising gale. Margaret's city coat, which had seemed so sturdy in Philadelphia, proved useless against the Montana cold. The wind did not simply blow, it clawed, finding every seam in her clothing, every vulnerable inch of exposed skin. In seconds, her cheeks burned and her eyes watered. She blinked rapidly, trying to see through the tears and the swirling snow. "Miss Vale?" The voice came from directly behind her, so low she almost missed it over the howl of the wind. She turned, and her first thought was that the mountains themselves had taken human form. John Rowan stood well over 6 feet tall, made larger by the heavy sheepskin coat that enveloped his broad frame. His snow-dusted hat shadowed a face that looked as if it had been carved from the same granite as the distant peaks, all sharp angles and weathered plains, a jaw that looked as if it could break stone, and eyes the color of a winter sky. Those eyes met hers for a fleeting moment before skittering away, as if prolonged contact might burn him. "Mr. Rowan?" Margaret's voice was smaller than she'd intended. He gave a single, sharp nod, a movement so slight she might have imagined it. Without a word, he took her trunk, lifting it as if it weighed nothing. His other hand reached for her carpet bag. "I can manage," she began, but he was already taking the bag with calloused fingers, careful not to let them touch hers in the transfer. "Storm's close," he murmured, the words almost lost to the wind. Then he turned and strode toward a wagon hitched to two massive draft horses, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Margaret stood frozen, and not just from the cold. This was the man she had crossed a continent to marry. This silent mountain of a man who couldn't even meet her gaze. His letters had been brief, yes, but they had been clear and carefully penned. They spoke of a home, of honest work, of a future. They had given her hope. But now, faced with the reality of him, that hope felt as fragile as the snowflakes melting on her lashes. The conductor appeared at her side, carrying the rest of her things. "Best not to keep him waiting, ma'am. He's right about that storm." She had no choice. She had spent her last coins on the train ticket. She had no family to return to, no home waiting for her in Philadelphia. She had burned her bridges as thoroughly as winter burned the prairie grass. Clutching her inadequate coat tighter, Margaret followed her silent fiancé to the wagon. John had already loaded her trunk in the back. He stood by the wagon, one huge hand extended to help her up. Margaret placed her gloved hand in his, and even through the layers of fabric, she felt the careful strength in his grip. He lifted her onto the seat as if she weighed no more than a child, then immediately released her and moved to his side. The wagon seat was narrow. When John settled beside her, his shoulder pressed against hers, solid as oak. He produced a heavy buffalo hide from beneath the seat, and without looking at her, draped it over her lap and legs. The gesture was clumsy, almost awkward, but the hide was warm and surprisingly soft. "Thank you," Margaret said. He gave that same, almost imperceptible nod and took up the reins. With a soft click of his tongue, the horses started forward. Copper Falls vanished behind them almost instantly, swallowed by the whiteout. The wind grew stronger, more violent, whipping snow into their faces. Margaret ducked her head, trying to shelter behind John's broad back. She wanted to ask how far they had to go, if they would make it before the storm hit full force, what awaited her at the end of this white road. But the set of his shoulders, the rigid way he held himself, told her questions would not be welcome. So she sat in silence, clinging to the lurching seat as the wagon rumbled over the frozen ground. Time became a strange, shapeless thing. It could have been minutes or hours. The world shrank to the space between one breath and the next, between one heartbeat and the next. Snow piled in the folds of the buffalo hide. Her fingers, even inside her gloves, grew numb. Just when Margaret thought she could not endure another moment of the cold, the silence, the uncertainty, John spoke. "There." She looked up, following his gaze. Through the ever-thickening snow, she could just make out a dark shape, a sturdy, square-built cabin with smoke curling from a stone chimney. Beside it stood a barn and what looked like a smaller outbuilding. Even through the storm, through her exhaustion and fear, Margaret felt a wave of something that might have been relief. The horses knew they were home. They quickened their pace, and within minutes, John pulled them to a stop before the barn. He set the brake, then turned to Margaret for the first time since they had left town. "Go to the house," he said, his voice rough, as if speaking required great effort. Doors unlocked. I'll see to the horses. I can help. Go. It wasn't unkind, but it left no room for argument. When Margaret climbed down from the wagon, John's hand steadying her for a brief, careful moment. The full fury of the storm hit her. The snow was no longer falling. It was flying sideways, erasing the world. She could barely see the cabin, though it was only a few yards away. Margaret ran, her city boots slipping on the icy ground, her skirts tangling around her legs. The cabin door opened easily, as John had promised, and she stumbled inside, gasping. The warmth hit her like a physical blow, so sudden and intense it was almost painful. Her frozen cheeks burned. Her fingers throbbed. The cabin was a single large room with a sleeping loft above. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flames dancing behind a screen. A table, two chairs, and a rocking chair comprised the sparse furniture. In the far corner, a door stood partially open, revealing a bedroom. The entire space felt clean and well kept, but it lacked the small touches that make a house a home. It felt less like a place someone lived, and more like a place someone simply existed. Margaret moved toward the hearth, pulling off her gloves with clumsy fingers. She heard John's heavy steps on the porch, and then he was there, carrying her trunk as if it were a hatbox. Snow clung to his coat and hat, turning him into a figure from a winter legend. He set the trunk down near the bedroom door and straightened. For a moment, he just stood there, snow melting in small puddles around his boots, looking at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Then, in that quiet voice that seemed to cost him something, he said, "The bedroom is yours. There's a stove in there to keep it warm. I sleep in the loft." Margaret blinked. "But I thought, we are to be married?" "When you're ready," he said. He took off his hat, revealing dark hair threaded with silver at the temples. "Not before. You're safe here, Miss Vale. You have my word." Something in her chest unclenched. She had been so afraid of this moment, of what he might expect, of how this first night might unfold. "Thank you, Mr. Rowan." "John," he said. "Just John." He hung his hat and then his coat on a peg by the door. Underneath, he wore simple work clothes, canvas trousers, a well-washed flannel shirt, and suspenders. Without the heavy coat, he seemed somehow more human, less like a mountain made flesh. "Are you hungry?" The question surprised her. "Yes, actually. I haven't eaten since this morning." He nodded and moved to the small kitchen area, which held a cast-iron stove, a dry sink, and shelves of basic provisions. His movements were efficient and spare, those of a man long accustomed to caring for himself. He built up the fire in the stove, set a kettle on to boil, and brought out what looked to be a loaf of bread and a pot of stew. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the table. Margaret sat, watching him work. He moved with a surprising grace for such a large man, every action purposeful and sure. Within minutes, he had set a steaming bowl of venison stew and thick slices of buttered bread before her. He poured tea, real tea, not the cheap substitute she had grown used to in Philadelphia. And then, to her astonishment, he sat across from her with a bowl of his own. They ate in silence, but it was a different silence than the one in the wagon. Here, with the storm roaring outside and the fire crackling warmly, the silence felt almost companionable. It was not an empty, awkward void, but a quiet space filled by the sounds of the storm and the scrape of spoons against bowls. Margaret watched him discreetly over the rim of her bowl. She noticed his hands were marked with old scars, white lines across the knuckles, a burn mark on his left wrist. They were working hands, capable hands. When she finished, the stew having been surprisingly good, rich and well-seasoned, John stood and took both their bowls to the sink. He poured hot water from the kettle and began to wash the dishes with the same methodical care he'd shown in preparing the meal. "I can do that," Margaret said, rising. "Please let me help." He paused, seeming to consider it. Then, slowly, he nodded and stepped aside. Margaret moved to stand beside him, taking the clean dishes he handed her and drying them with a cloth. They worked together without speaking, and gradually, Margaret felt some of the tension of the long day begin to ease. When the last dish was put away, John went to the fireplace and added 2 more logs. The flames leaped, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He stood there, one hand on the mantel, staring into the fire as if it might hold the answers to questions he could not bring himself to speak. Margaret's gaze fell upon something she hadn't noticed before. Photographs on the mantelpiece. Drawn by a curiosity that outweighed her caution, she moved closer. There were 3 frames. The first held a picture of a smiling young woman with soft features and kind eyes, holding a baby. The second showed the same woman, older now, standing beside John, a younger John, with fewer gray hairs and something akin to happiness on his face. In his arms, he held a small boy, perhaps 4 years old. The third frame contained only a pressed flower, a wild rose, faded but carefully preserved. Margaret held her breath. She looked from the photos to John, to his rigid shoulders, to the white knuckles of the hand gripping the mantel, and suddenly, she understood. The conductor's words echoed in her memory. He has his reasons for his silence. "Your family," she said softly. It wasn't a question. John's jaw tightened. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice little more than a whisper, he said, "Sarah, my wife, and Thomas, our son." "What happened?" He shook his head, still not looking at her. "Not tonight. I can't." "Not tonight?" Margaret wanted to press, wanted to know what had carved such deep furrows of sorrow into this man's face. But something in his voice, the raw, barely contained grief, stopped her. Instead, she said simply, "I'm sorry for your loss." He gave that minimal nod she was beginning to recognize as his primary form of communication. Then he straightened, forcing his shoulders back. "You should get some sleep. It's been a long day." "Yes," Margaret agreed, though she wasn't sure sleep would come easily. Not with the fury of the storm and the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on her. "Good night, John." "Good night," he murmured. And then, for a brief instant, his eyes met hers. In that moment, Margaret saw past the wall of silence, saw the man beneath the sorrow, and she realized he was drowning. The room was small but adequate, furnished with a brass bed covered in a thick quilt, a commode, a washstand, and a small wood-burning stove that John had already lit. The warmth was a blessing after the chill of the journey. Margaret's valise sat at the foot of the bed, waiting to be unpacked. With trembling fingers, she changed into her nightgown, unable to tell if she shivered from the cold or the emotion of the evening. When she finally slipped beneath the covers, the bed was soft and surprisingly comfortable. She could hear John moving about in the main room, the quiet sounds of him stoking the fire, checking the door. climbing the ladder to the loft. Then silence, broken only by the howl of the wind and the occasional crackle from the stove. Margaret lay in the darkness, trying to process everything that had happened in the last 12 hours. She had left Philadelphia as Margaret Vale, spinster seamstress, a woman the world had written off as superfluous. She had arrived in Montana as what? A mail-order bride yet unclaimed, a housekeeper, a stranger sharing a space with another stranger. The wind wailed, and she thought of the woman in the photographs. Sarah. Had she slept in this bed? Had she woken to John's quiet presence, secure in the knowledge that she was loved? What would she think of Margaret, this intruder, sleeping where she had slept? And of John? What torment kept him awake in the loft? What memories haunted him on nights when the wind howled like this? Margaret pulled the quilt tighter and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would bring answers, or it wouldn't. For now, she was warm, she was safe, and she was a world away from Philadelphia. That would have to be enough. The storm hit with its full force just before dawn. Margaret awoke to a world transformed into a white fury. The wind no longer howled, it screamed. A living thing, trying to tear the cabin apart, board by board. Snow pressed against the window pane, blocking all light. She dressed quickly, shivering despite the stove's warmth, and stepped out of the room to find John already awake. He was standing by the window, fully dressed, staring into the white chaos with an expression that sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. "How long will it last?" she asked. He turned, seeming unsurprised by her presence. "Days, maybe a week. I've seen worse." He paused, then added, "But not much worse." The implication settled on Margaret like a physical weight. They were trapped here, cut off from the world. Two strangers, forced into close quarters by weather and circumstance. The cabin, which had seemed adequate the night before, now felt impossibly small. "What do we do?" she asked. The corner of John's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, but it was a close cousin. "We survive, Miss Vale. The way we always do." "Margaret," she said, "if we're to be trapped together, you should call me Margaret." He considered this, then nodded once. "Margaret." Her name in his low, gravelly voice sounded strange, almost foreign, but not unpleasant. "Coffee's on. I'll need to check the horses soon." Margaret moved to the window, pressing her hand against the icy glass. She could barely see 3 feet ahead. "Is that safe?" "I've a rope stretched between the house and the barn for storms like this. You follow the rope. You can't get lost." He poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to her. Their fingers brushed as the mug exchanged hands, and she felt the calluses on his palm, the warmth of his skin. Learned that lesson the hard way. Margaret wanted to ask what he meant, but something in his face told her it was another story for another time. She took a sip of the coffee, strong and black, the way men drank it, and tried not to cough. John noticed. "Too strong?" "No," she lied, but then relented under his knowing gaze. "Perhaps a little." He took her cup without a word and returned it a moment later, diluted with hot water and a splash of milk from a covered pitcher. The gesture was small, but it felt significant to Margaret. This silent man, paying attention, making an adjustment without being asked. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and pulled on his heavy coat. "Could be an hour. The horses need feeding. Water trough needs to be broken. The cows out there, too, needs milking." You have a cow? Margaret didn't know why that surprised her, but it did. It seemed such a domestic detail for this rugged, solitary man. Fresh milk comes in handy, John said simply. He pulled on thick gloves and wrapped a scarf around his face until only his eyes were visible. At the door, he paused. Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me. 3 knocks. A pause, 2 knocks. That's how you'll know it's me. Are we in danger? Margaret's heart began to beat faster. No, but storms make the animals desperate. Had a bear come around 2 winters ago, tried to get in. He looked at her. Be careful. He pulled the door open, and the storm lunged inside. A blast of wind and snow that made Margaret gasp. Then he was gone, forcing the door shut behind him. Margaret slid the heavy wooden bar into place and stood there, listening to the wind, feeling more alone than she ever had in her life. In Philadelphia, at least, she'd been surrounded by people, by the noise and bustle of city life. Here, there was only the white silence and the shrieking storm. She turned back to the cabin, surveying her small domain. John was right. They had to survive, and surviving meant keeping busy. The next hour passed in a flurry of activity. Margaret explored the cabin properly for the first time, taking a mental inventory of the supplies. The pantry held the basics: flour, salt, sugar, dried beans, jars of preserved vegetables. It wasn't luxurious, but it was sufficient. There was a barrel of apples just beginning to soften, and several wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth. A cured ham hung from a hook in the corner, and strips of dried venison filled a tin. She swept the floor, finding the corn broom behind the door. She washed their few breakfast dishes and wiped down the table. She added wood to both stoves, careful to place the logs just as she had seen John do. She was peering into the pantry, considering making bread, when she heard it. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 knocks. Margaret hurried to the door and lifted the bar. John stumbled inside, caked in snow from head to toe, ice clinging to his scarf. She shut the door behind him and slid the bar home. Are you all right? She asked as he unwrapped the scarf with stiff fingers. I'm fine. But his face was raw where the skin showed, and his movements were slow and deliberate. He had been out there for well over an hour. What happened? Cow was down. Had to get her up, check her for frostbite. He pulled off his gloves, and Margaret saw that his hands were raw, the knuckles split and bleeding slightly. She'll be fine. Horses, too. Your hands, Margaret said, stepping closer. Let me see. He tried to pull away, but she took his wrist, her grip gentle but firm. His skin was ice cold, the cracks oozing thin lines of blood. Without thinking, Margaret led him to the wash basin, poured in warm, not hot, water, and eased his hands into it. John hissed through his teeth but didn't pull away. It's nothing, he said. It's not nothing. They'll get infected. Margaret found a clean cloth, and once his hands were sufficiently warmed, she dried them carefully. The fissures weren't deep, but they needed attention. Do you have any salve? Bandages? He gestured with his chin toward a cupboard. Medical supplies. Top shelf. Margaret found what she needed: a tin of strong-smelling ointment and strips of clean linen. She worked with a gentle efficiency, applying the salve to each crack and crevice, then wrapping his hands in loose bandages. John sat perfectly still the entire time, watching her with an intensity that unsettled her. There, she said when she was finished. Try to keep them dry for a few hours. Thank you. The words were quiet but sincere. He looked down at his bandaged hands, flexing his fingers experimentally. "You've done this before. My father was a fishmonger in Philadelphia, always cutting or burning himself. I learned young." The memory brought an unexpected sting to her eyes. Her father had been gone 5 years, her mother following the next winter. She blinked the tears away quickly. "You should change into dry clothes. I'll make us something to eat." John nodded and climbed the ladder to the loft. Margaret listened to him moving about overhead. The creak of the floorboards, the rustle of fabric. She focused on the kitchen, on the immediate practical task of cooking. She found fresh eggs, still slightly warm, in a basket John must have brought in. There was bacon in the cool box, and bread left over from the night before. When John came back down, dressed in dry clothes, his damp hair combed back with his fingers, Margaret had a simple breakfast ready. They ate together at the small table, the storm still raging outside. This time, it was Margaret who broke the silence. "Tell me about the farm," she said. "How long have you had it?" John chewed slowly, thinking. 8 years. Bought it with money I'd earned from cattle driving, plus some Sarah brought from her family. Built the cabin that first summer, the barn the next spring. He stopped, his jaw working. "We had plans." "She was beautiful," Margaret said softly. "In the photographs." John stared at his plate. Beautiful, and kind, and patient, with a man who didn't have many words even back then. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "She could fill the silence. The house felt alive when she was in it. Now, it's just empty," Margaret finished for him. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of true connection in his eyes. "Yes." They finished their breakfast in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet now, the kind that exists between people who have shared a moment of truth. When the dishes were cleared and put away, John went to his chair by the fire and picked up a book. Not poetry, as Margaret might have expected, but a thick veterinary manual. He read with the same intense focus he gave to everything, occasionally making notes on a scrap of paper beside him. Margaret found her sewing in her valise. Mrs. Henderson had given her several pieces of mending to work on during her journey, as a final payment for her years of service. She settled into the rocking chair. Sarah's chair, she thought, but pushed the thought away, and began to work. The day passed in that quiet rhythm. John read, occasionally rising to tend the fire or check the windows. Margaret stitched, her needle moving in and out in the meditative pattern she had known since childhood. They spoke little, but as the hours passed, a measure of the tension between them began to thaw, almost imperceptibly. Late in the afternoon, John set his book aside and rose to his feet. "I need to check on the animals again." "I'll go with you," Margaret said, putting down her sewing. He frowned. "It's dangerous." "You'll hold the rope? I'll hold on to you. I'd like to see the barn, to know the animals are settled properly." When he still hesitated, she added, "Please, John, I'm to live here. I should know the way." He considered this, then gave a slow nod. "All right, but you stay close. Don't let go of me for any reason." They bundled up, John wrapping Margaret in one of his spare coats that nearly swallowed her whole, winding a thick scarf around the lower half of her face. At the door, he took her hand, his grip firm, and tucked her into the crook of his arm. "Hold tight," he said, "and keep your head down." The storm hit them like a physical wall. Margaret gasped, the breath stolen from her lungs by the wind. Snow stung every inch of exposed skin. She couldn't see John, couldn't see anything but a churning vortex of white. Only his solid presence beside her, the guide rope taut in his hand, kept her anchored to reality. They pressed forward into the gale, and for the first time, Margaret understood why John spoke so little. In a world like this, words were useless. Only action mattered. Only survival. The barn appeared suddenly, a dark shape materializing out of the white. John heaved the door open, and they stumbled inside, gasping for air. The contrast was jarring. The howling chaos outside, the sudden muffled silence within. The barn smelled of hay, horse, and the warm-bodied presence of animals, and to Margaret, it smelled of sanctuary. Two massive draft horses occupied the first two stalls, the same pair that had pulled the wagon from town. They nickered softly as John approached, clearly glad to see him. In the third stall, a brown and white cow chewed its cud placidly, utterly indifferent to the tempest raging outside. "This is Duke and Duchess," John told her, indicating the horses. He pulled apples from his coat pocket and gave one to each, his bandaged hands moving gently over their velvety noses. "And that's Clover." Margaret approached the horses cautiously. She'd seen plenty of horses in Philadelphia, of course, but these were different. They were enormous creatures with feet the size of dinner plates and kind, intelligent eyes. Duchess turned her great head to look at her. "From a duchess." John's voice caught slightly on his wife's name, but he pressed on. Clover was Thomas's project. He was to learn to milk her, care for her. He was excited about it. "How old was he?" Margaret asked softly. "He was 5. Just turned 5. John moved to Clover's stall and began the milking process with practiced efficiency. The fever took them both. A late winter storm, just like this one. Sarah first, then Thomas, 3 days later. His hands stilled on the pail. I couldn't get to town for the doctor. The storm blocked the trails for nearly a week. By the time I could get out, he was gone. Didn't need him anymore." Margaret came up behind him and laid a hand lightly on his shoulder. He flinched at the touch, but then relaxed into it, just slightly. "That's why you were afraid," she said. "Last night, when you looked at the storm, you were remembering." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They stood there in the quiet barn, the only sounds the gentle chewing of the animals and the muted howl of the wind. Finally, John cleared his throat and resumed his milking. "We should get back," he said when he was finished. "The storm's getting worse." The journey back to the cabin was even more harrowing than the one to the barn. The wind had risen, if such a thing were possible, and the snow fell so thick that Margaret couldn't draw a breath without inhaling ice. She clung to John's arm with both hands, her face buried in his shoulder, trusting him completely to guide them home. When they finally stumbled back inside, both were shaking with cold and exhaustion. John barred the door while Margaret collapsed into a chair, her teeth chattering. He brought her a blanket and a cup of coffee, brewed without her asking, just the way she liked it, and stood by the fire until some color returned to her cheeks. "Thank you," Margaret said, when she could speak without shivering. "For showing me, for trusting me enough to take me out there." John looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. "You didn't have to come. Most women wouldn't have." "I'm not most women," Margaret said. And this is my home now, too. I ought to know it. Your home, he repeated, as if testing the words. Then, so quietly, she almost missed it. Yes, I suppose it is. That evening, they cooked supper together, Margaret preparing vegetables while John seasoned a roast from the cold storage. They moved around the small kitchen with a new ease, learning each other's rhythms. When John reached past her for the salt, Margaret didn't startle. When she needed to get to the pantry behind him, he moved without her having to ask. They ate at the table, the storm still raging, and this time John asked questions. Where had she grown up? What brought her to Montana? What did she hope to find here? Margaret answered honestly, telling him of the loneliness of Philadelphia, of the years watching other women marry while she was left behind, the slow, crushing weight of being unwanted. She told him of Mrs. Henderson's shop, of the endless parade of bridal gowns she sewed for other brides, of the small advertisement she'd found in a newspaper on a desperate evening. You answered my letter, John said. Why? Because you were honest, Margaret replied. You didn't promise love or romance. You promised a roof, a future, and honest work. After all the pretty lies I'd heard from men in Philadelphia, promises they had no intention of keeping, your honesty was a relief. John nodded slowly. I can't promise love. I don't know if I have that left in me, but I can promise the rest, and I can promise I will never lie to you. That's enough, Margaret said, and she meant it. For now, that's enough. They washed the dishes together, and Margaret found herself humming an old tune her mother used to sing. Something about sailors and storms and finding a safe harbor. She didn't realize she was doing it until John spoke. That's pretty. What is? She asked. And he listened with the same intense focus he brought to everything. When she finished, he said, Sarah used to hum when she worked. Different songs, but the same sort of quiet sound. I'd forgotten how much I missed it. It wasn't quite a compliment, but it felt like one. Margaret smiled and continued to hum as she dried the last plate. That night, alone in her room, Margaret finally unpacked her trunk properly. She hung her few dresses in the wardrobe, placed her underthings in the chest of drawers, and set her hairbrush and hand mirror on the dressing table. She took out her mother's wedding veil, still wrapped in tissue, and held it for a long moment, before placing it carefully in the bottom drawer. In the main room, she could hear John moving about, stoking the fire, checking the door one last time. His footsteps on the ladder, the creak of the loft floorboards above, the sounds of another person, the sounds of not being alone. The storm raged on, but inside the small cabin, Margaret felt something she hadn't expected to feel. The smallest, most fragile, nascent peace. The second day of the storm dawned gray and relentless. Margaret woke to the sound of the wind battering the cabin walls with a renewed fury, as if it had spent the night gathering strength for a fresh assault. She lay in bed for a moment, listening to the familiar creaks and groans of the cabin, the distant sound of John already moving about in the main room. When she emerged, fully dressed with her hair pinned back, she found him standing at the window with his coffee, staring out at the white chaos with the same haunted expression she'd seen yesterday. But today, when he heard her footfalls, he turned, and something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched his face. Morning, he said, and handed her a mug. He'd already made her coffee, just how she liked it, mostly milk, lightly sweetened with a precious spoonful of sugar. You remembered, Margaret said, surprised and strangely touched by the small gesture. Not much else to do but pay attention, John replied, but there was no bitterness in his tone. He gestured to the stove, where a pot of oatmeal was bubbling gently. Hope you like oatmeal. The winter diet gets monotonous. I've had worse, Margaret assured him, thinking of the thin gruel that had often been her breakfast in Philadelphia. Much worse. They ate at the table, and Margaret noticed that John's hands, though still bandaged, moved with less stiffness this morning. The salve had worked. When he caught her looking, he flexed his fingers self-consciously. Better, he said. Thank you for that. You don't have to keep thanking me for small kindnesses, John. We're partners in this, aren't we? The word seemed to surprise him. Partners? Yes, I think we are. He was silent for a moment, then added, Sarah used to say something like that. That a marriage was a partnership, not a kingdom with a single ruler. Margaret set her spoon down carefully. Do you want to talk about her? About them? John's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would retreat back into his silence. But then slowly, he began to speak. I met her in town, at the general store. She was visiting from Helena, staying with her aunt. I'd gone in for supplies, and there she was, trying to lift a sack of flour. The storekeeper wasn't helping, busy arguing prices with a rancher. So I helped her. John stared down at his oatmeal, but Margaret could tell he wasn't seeing it. He was somewhere in the past, reliving a moment from 8 years ago. She thanked me, and I just couldn't stop looking at her. She had a smile that made you feel like you'd done something worthwhile just by existing. She sounds wonderful, Margaret said softly. She was too good for me. Everyone said so, but she didn't seem to mind. We courted for 3 months, the longest 3 months of my life. Then we were married in that little church in Copper Falls. Reverend Parker did the service. Thomas was born a year later, and for a while everything was... He trailed off, his throat tight. Perfect. Margaret reached across the table and laid her hand over his bandaged one. He went still at first, then slowly turned his hand palm up, allowing her to hold it. The fever came on fast, John continued, his voice rough. A January storm, much like this one. Sarah complained of feeling tired. By evening, she was burning up. I rode for town the next morning, but the doctor was out at another homestead. An emergency, a breech birth. By the time I got back, Thomas was sick too, and the storm hit that night. The worst I'd ever seen. 3 feet of snow in 12 hours. Drifts twice that high. His hand tightened on Margaret's, almost painfully, but she didn't pull away. I did everything I could. Cold cloths, every remedy I knew. Sarah was strong. She fought. But Thomas, he was so small. The fever just kept climbing. I couldn't leave for help. The snow was too deep, the wind too strong. I'd have died trying, and then they would have been alone. His voice broke. Sarah knew. On the 3rd day, she knew she wasn't going to make it. She made me promise I'd keep going, that I wouldn't let this place become a tomb. Then she asked me to care for Thomas. I promised her that too. Tears were now streaming silently down Margaret's face, but she stayed quiet, letting him speak. She died that night. Just slipped away while I was holding her hand. Thomas held on for 2 more days, calling for her, asking why she wouldn't wake up. I couldn't. I didn't know how to tell him she was gone. So I lied to my dying son. I told him she was just sleeping, that she'd be up soon." John's voice dropped to a ragged whisper. He died believing that lie. Died waiting for his mother to wake up and make him better. "Oh, John," Margaret breathed. She stood and moved around the table, pulling his head against her shoulder in an awkward but heartfelt embrace. He was rigid for a moment. Then his arms came around her waist, and he clung to her, his body shaking with silent, shuddering sobs. They stayed like that for a long time, the storm howling outside, as John finally allowed himself to grieve in the presence of another person. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were red-rimmed, but somehow clearer, as if telling the story had released some of the poison it held. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice raw. "I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize," Margaret said, her voice firm. "Not for being sad. Never for that." He nodded, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "I've never told anyone the whole story, not even the Reverend. The people in town know Sarah and Thomas died, but they don't know the details. They don't know how I failed them." "You didn't fail them," Margaret said, returning to her seat, but keeping her hand on his. "You did everything that was humanly possible. The storm, the fever, those things were beyond your control. You cannot blame yourself for acts of God." Sarah said the same thing near the end. Made me swear I wouldn't carry the guilt for something I couldn't prevent. He let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "I promised her that too. It seems I'm not very good at keeping my word." "Then keep it now," Margaret insisted. "Honor her memory by living, not by letting this cabin become the tomb she feared. That's what she would have wanted, isn't it?" John looked at her, something akin to awe in his eyes. "How are you so wise?" "I'm not wise. I'm practical. And I've learned that the dead don't want us to die with them. They want us to carry their love into whatever comes next." She gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "Your Sarah sounds like a woman who understood that." "She was," John agreed, his voice soft. Then, with a visible effort, he straightened his shoulders. "Enough mourning. There's work to be done, storm or no storm. The animals need tending. Wood needs to be brought in." "Then let's do it together," Margaret said. "And after, I'd like to bake bread, if there's enough flour. This cabin needs to smell of something other than sadness." That ghost of a smile returned to John's face. "There's plenty of flour. Sarah always kept extra. Said the smell of baking bread made a house a home." "Smart woman," Margaret said, and began to clear away the breakfast dishes. The day fell into a rhythm much like the one before, yet the silence between them held a different quality. John went out to tend to the animals, alone this time, as the storm was too fierce for Margaret to safely accompany him. While he was gone, she explored the cabin more thoroughly, opening cupboards and drawers with the careful curiosity of someone trying to understand their new home. In the bedroom dresser, she found women's clothes, neatly folded, Sarah's things, preserved as if she might return at any moment. Dresses, shawls, underthings, all clean and carefully put away. Margaret's first instinct was to leave them untouched, to respect the shrine John had created. But then she thought of Sarah's words, relayed through John's memory, about not letting this place become a tomb. When John returned, shaking snow from his boots and unwinding his scarf, Margaret was waiting in the main room with a question she had rehearsed. "John, I found Sarah's clothes in the bedroom dresser. I don't mean to intrude, but I need a place for my own things. Would it be all right if I packed them away?" His face became a careful mask. You want to get rid of her things? No, not get rid of them, just store them away carefully and with respect, perhaps in a trunk in the barn. That way they would be preserved, but not, she searched for the right words, not taking up the space meant for the living. John stood very still, water from the melting snow dripping onto the floorboards. Margaret held her breath, afraid she had pushed too far, too soon. Then, slowly, he nodded. You're right. She would have been the first to say so. Sarah was never one for dwelling on the past. He took off his coat and hung it on its peg. There's a trunk in the barn, a good cedar one that belonged to her grandmother. We can use that. Together they approached the task with a solemn care. Margaret handled each garment, folding it properly before John placed it in the chest he'd brought in from the barn. A blue calico dress with tiny white flowers. A worn but carefully mended wool skirt in a shade of forest green. A white nightgown with delicate embroidery at the collar. Each item told a story, painting a portrait of a woman who valued practicality but appreciated beauty. At the bottom of the drawer, wrapped in tissue paper, Margaret found a wedding gown. It was a simple dress of cream-colored muslin with lace at the neck and cuffs. It had yellowed slightly with age, but it was still beautiful in its simplicity. She made that herself, John said softly, moving to stand beside Margaret. Took her 3 months. She was so proud of it. Wore it like it was silk and jewels. As Margaret held the dress, a photograph slipped from its folds. She caught it before it hit the floor. It was another picture of Sarah and John on their wedding day, both looking impossibly young and happy. John wore a suit that was clearly borrowed, the sleeves a touch too short. Sarah clutched a bouquet of wild roses. Keep that one out, John said. Put it with the others on the mantel. She deserves to be remembered. She does, Margaret agreed, setting it aside. She carefully folded the wedding dress and placed it in the trunk. She deserves to be honored, not forgotten. But John, honoring the dead doesn't mean we stop living. I know, he said. I'm starting to know. It's just hard to let go. You're not letting go. You're making room. There's a difference. They finished packing the trunk in silence. John carried it back to the barn, while Margaret wiped down the dresser and arranged her own modest belongings inside. It felt strange to occupy the space that had belonged to another woman, but it also felt necessary. This was her home now, her life. She could not live as a ghost in Sarah's house. When John returned, Margaret was already working the bread dough, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Flour, water, salt, and yeast blended beneath her fingers, transforming into something pliant and alive. John watched her, a look of undisguised fascination on his face. You're good at that, he remarked. I should be. I've made enough loaves to fill a bakery. Margaret kneaded the dough with a steady, rhythmic motion. My mother taught me when I was 6. Said a woman who could bake a good loaf would never go hungry. She was right about that. John moved to the table and sat, seeming content to watch her work. Sarah tried to teach me, but I could never get the hang of it. Hers always came out perfect and golden. Mine were as hard as bricks. The secret is all in the kneading, Margaret said. Not enough, and it won't rise right. Too much, and it gets tough. You have to feel when it's just right. She shaped the dough into a smooth ball and placed it in a greased bowl, covering it with a clean cloth. Now it rests and rises. In a few hours, we'll have fresh bread for supper. I look forward to it, John said, and he actually smiled. A real smile this time, not a sketch of one. It transformed his face, making him look years younger. Margaret found herself smiling back, feeling something warm expand in her chest. While the bread rose, they settled into the quiet rhythm of the day. John returned to his veterinarian's manual, making occasional notes. Margaret found a worn Bible on the bookshelf, Sarah's, based on the name inscribed inside, and settled into the rocking chair to read. The storm continued to lash at the cabin, but inside, a different kind of peace was taking hold. Midday came and went. Margaret made sandwiches with yesterday's bread and sliced ham, and they ate in a companionable silence. After the meal, John surprised her by pulling out a checkerboard. "Do you play?" he asked. "I do, though I'm not very good." "Good, neither am I. Sarah used to win every time." They set up the board on the table, and Margaret quickly discovered John had understated his skill. He played with a careful strategy, thinking several moves ahead. Still, Margaret managed to hold her own, and when she finally captured his last piece, John actually laughed, a rusty sound, as if the muscles for it had forgotten their purpose. "You lied," he accused, with no heat in his voice. "You're more than good." "I said I wasn't very good," she countered, a playful smile on her lips. "I never said I didn't win." They reset the board. They played 3 more games, trading victories, and with each one John seemed to relax a little more. By the 4th game he was making jokes, dry, subtle quips that took Margaret a moment to recognize as humor. She found herself laughing, a genuine, free sound she hadn't made in months. When the dough had risen, Margaret shaped it into loaves and placed them in the oven. The scent that began to fill the cabin was glorious, yeasty and warm, promising comfort and sustenance. John closed his book and simply sat, breathing in the aroma with his eyes closed. "I'd forgotten how good that smells," he murmured. "Thank you, Margaret." "You're welcome, but you might want to wait until you've tasted it before you thank me." But when the bread came out, golden and perfect, and Margaret sliced into it, revealing a soft, airy crumb, John's expression said what words could not. They ate the fresh bread with melting butter, and for several minutes, the only sound was that of satisfied chewing. "This," John said finally, "is the best bread I have ever tasted, and I'm including Sarah's in that comparison. Don't you tell her I said that." Margaret felt a ridiculous surge of pleasure at the compliment. "I won't tell a soul." As evening settled, John grew quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence, thoughtful rather than withdrawn. He stared into the fire, his brow furrowed as he wrestled with a thought. Margaret went on with her sewing, giving him the space he needed. Finally, he spoke. "Margaret, I need to ask you something." She set down her mending. "All right. Why did you really come here? Not the surface reasons. I understand about Philadelphia and being alone and all of that. But what makes a person travel clear across a continent to marry a stranger?" Margaret considered the question, knowing he deserved an honest answer. "Because I was disappearing," she said at last. "In Philadelphia, I was becoming invisible. With every year that passed without a husband, without children, I became less real to the world around me. People stopped seeing a person and started seeing a cautionary tale. The spinster who waited too long, or aimed too high, or was simply unlucky." John nodded, his eyes fixed on her face. "I grew tired of being invisible," Margaret continued. "I wanted to matter again. And your advertisement, with its honesty and lack of pretense, offered a chance at that. A chance to build something real, even if it wasn't a love match. To have a purpose beyond sewing other women's dreams. She looked him directly in the eye. I came here to save my own life, John. Perhaps that's selfish, but it's the truth. It's not selfish, John said firmly. It's honest, and I appreciate honesty. He was quiet for a moment, then added, I should be honest with you too. I didn't place that advertisement looking for a wife. Not really. I was looking for a reason to go on. After Sarah and Thomas died, this place, it felt empty. Too big for just me, and too full of memories. I thought maybe if someone else was here it would be easier to remember why I built it in the first place. And is it? Margaret asked softly. Is it easier? John considered this. Yes and no, it's hard having you here. Seeing someone else in Sarah's kitchen, in Sarah's chair. But it's a good kind of hard. Does that make any sense? It makes perfect sense, Margaret assured him. Change is always difficult, even when it's necessary. They sat in silence for a time, the fire crackling and the storm still raging outside, but it felt somehow less menacing than before. Margaret picked up her sewing, and John returned to his book, but there was an understanding between them now that hadn't existed before. They were two wounded people, trying to heal, and maybe, just maybe, they could help each other do it. Night fell early, as it does in winter, and with it came a new sound, a sharp crack followed by a heavy thud that shook the cabin. John was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. What was that? Margaret asked, setting aside her needlework. Tree branch, probably. Winds strong enough to snap one. He peered out into the darkness, then tensed. No, wait. It's not a branch. Something's wrong with the barn. He was already pulling on his coat before Margaret could respond. I'm coming with you. Margaret, no, stay here. Don't argue, she said, already grabbing her own wrap. If something's wrong, you might need help. 4 hands are better than 2. John hesitated for only a second, then gave a curt nod. Stay right behind me. Hold on to my coat. And don't let go for anything. They stepped out into a nightmare. The storm had intensified to a degree Margaret hadn't thought possible. The wind didn't howl. It screamed. A living thing bent on tearing them apart. Snow fell horizontally, each flake a tiny, stinging blade. Margaret buried her face in John's back and gripped his coat with both hands, trusting him completely as they fought their way toward the barn. A journey that felt like it took an eternity. When they finally reached it, John threw open the door, and they staggered inside, gasping for breath. The horses were skittish, stamping their hooves and snorting. Clover whinnied nervously from her stall, and above them, a section of the barn roof had given way, crushed by the weight of snow and ice. Damn it! John exclaimed. He looked up at the damaged roof, where snow was already starting to drift through the gap. This is bad. If the whole roof goes, the animals will freeze. What do we do? Margaret asked. We need to brace it from the inside. Keep the weight distributed until the storm passes and I can fix it properly. John was already moving, assessing the damage with an experienced eye. There's lumber stacked in the back corner. We need to build supports under the weak spots. They worked by the dim light of a single lantern, Margaret holding the boards steady while John hammered them into place. Her arms ached from the strain. Her hands grew numb despite her gloves, but she didn't complain. The animals' lives depended on them getting this right. An hour passed, maybe more. John had created a framework of braces, carefully distributing the weight. When he finally stepped back to survey his work, he nodded in grim satisfaction. That'll hold. It's not pretty, but it'll hold until I can make proper repairs. They made their way back to the cabin through the storm, exhausted and frozen. Margaret's teeth were chattering so hard she bit her tongue, tasting blood. John looked little better, his face a gray mask of cold and fatigue. Inside, he stoked both fireplaces while Margaret heated water for tea. They sat before the hearth, wrapped in blankets, waiting for the warmth to seep back into their bones. John's hands trembled as he held his mug, and Margaret noticed his bandages had come loose during their work. The cracks in his skin had reopened and were bleeding again. "Let me see," she said, setting her own mug down. He started to protest, but she was firm. "John Rowan, let me see your hands." He relented, perhaps too tired to argue. Margaret tended to them again, cleaning away the blood and grime, applying fresh salve, and wrapping them in clean bandages. His skin was ice cold, and she found herself rubbing his hands between her own, trying to restore circulation. "You're good at this," John said, his voice low. "Taking care of people. It's a gift." "It was necessity that made it seem like a gift," Margaret replied. But she was pleased all the same. "My parents needed care. I learned. Not everyone would have gone out in that storm with me. You could have stayed safe by the fire and let me risk it alone. That wouldn't have been right." He met her gaze. "We're partners, remember? Partners share the risks." Something shifted in John's expression, a softening, an opening. "Yes," he said, "partners." They sat in a comfortable silence until the shivering finally stopped. Then Margaret made a late supper, a soup of dried beans and vegetables, with more fresh bread. They ate slowly, both still recovering from the cold and the exertion. As they cleared away the meal, John spoke again. "Tomorrow, if the storm lets up enough, I'll need to check that roof more closely. Might need to make some temporary patches, even in the snow." "I'll help," Margaret said immediately. "It's dangerous work, Margaret." She turned to face him squarely. "I'm not fragile. I won't break. Let me help." He watched her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but you follow my instructions to the letter. Roofs are tricky, especially in winter." "I will," Margaret promised. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the storm and the sounds of John moving about in the loft above, Margaret realized something had changed. The cabin no longer felt like Sarah's house, where she was an intruder. It was becoming something else, a shared space, a home being built by two people who were learning to trust one another. The third day dawned with the storm still raging, but with a fraction less fury. The wind had dropped from a shriek to a roar, and the snow, though still heavy, was no longer falling in blinding sheets. John stood at the window, assessing the conditions with the eye of a man who had survived many Montana winters. "It's easing up," he said, as Margaret joined him. "Another day, maybe two, and it'll pass." "Will the barn hold until then?" "It should, but I'd feel better checking those braces in the daylight." He looked at her. "Still want to help?" "I do." They made the trip to the damaged barn. Together, they added more reinforcements. Working as an efficient team, Margaret found she enjoyed the work. The physical strain, the clear problem with a clear solution, the satisfaction of seeing immediate results. In Philadelphia, her work had been delicate and precise. but ultimately decorative. This was different. This was survival, and there was an honesty to it she found deeply satisfying. When they returned to the cabin, both of them flushed from the exertion, despite the cold. John remarked, "You're stronger than you look." Margaret laughed. "Is that a compliment?" "Yes," he smiled, that rare, transformative smile of his. "Definitely a compliment. Most city women would have fainted at the first sign of real work." "Then it's a good thing I'm not like most city women," Margaret replied, echoing his words from their first night. She hung up her coat and moved to the kitchen. "What do you say to stew for dinner? I noticed you have plenty of venison. Sarah used to make a stew with dried cherries." He paused, then consciously continued, "I can write down the recipe if you'd like to try it." It was the first time he had mentioned Sarah without a shadow of pain crossing his face. Margaret felt something warm blossom in her chest. "I would like that very much." They spent the afternoon in domestic harmony. John wrote out the recipe in his careful, precise script, while Margaret prepared the ingredients. He added notes. "Don't be shy with the pepper and let it simmer for at least 2 hours," along with personal remarks that brought the recipe to life. Margaret realized it was a gift. He was sharing his wife's legacy, inviting Margaret to become part of the cabin's story, rather than trying to replace what had been lost. The stew was wonderful, rich and savory with a hint of sweetness from the cherries. They ate together at the table, and John said it was almost as good as Sarah's, which Margaret took as the highest of compliments. After dinner, as they were clearing the table, John spoke hesitantly. "There's something I probably ought to show you in the loft, if you're willing." Curious, Margaret followed him up the ladder. The loft was small but tidy. A bed, a chest, a few pegs for clothes. But what drew her eye was the far corner, where a rocking horse stood next to a small wooden bed, both draped with sheets to protect them from dust. "Thomas's things," John said, his voice quiet. I haven't been able to put them away. Every time I try, His voice caught in his throat. Margaret approached the shrouded furniture slowly, reverently. "May I?" At John's nod, she lifted the sheet from the rocking horse. It was beautifully made, painted a dapple gray with a black mane and tail, clearly crafted with love. The small bed beside it was just as fine, with carved posts and a mattress still covered by tiny quilts. "Did you make these?" Margaret asked. "The bed and the horse, yes. Sarah made the quilts." John's voice was raw. "I started them the day she found out she was pregnant. Finished the set before Thomas was born." Margaret ran a hand over the rocking horse's carved mane. "They're beautiful, John. True works of art." Thomas loved that horse. He'd ride it every day, gave it different names depending on his mood. He was thunder when he felt brave, snowflake when it was winter, starlight when he was dreaming. John came to stand beside her, his hand covering hers where it rested on the horse's back. He would have been 5 in March. Sarah was planning a party, had it all mapped out. "And then the fever came," Margaret finished softly. She turned to him. "What do you want to do with these things, John? What does your heart really want?" He was silent for a long time, gazing at the rocking horse as memories flickered across his face. Finally, he spoke. "I want to keep them, not hidden away in a chest, but out, where I can see them, where I can remember what we built together. But I also want—" He struggled for the words. "I want to stop feeling like keeping them means I'm waiting for him to come back. Does that make any sense? It makes perfect sense, Margaret assured him. These things honor Thomas's memory. They don't need to be hidden away to be respected. Perhaps we could find a corner for them in the main room. Display them properly, the way you display Sarah's photograph. John considered this, then slowly nodded. Yes. Yes, I think that would be good. Sarah would have liked that, keeping his things where we could appreciate them, instead of tucked away in the dark. Together they carried the rocking horse and the small bed down from the loft. John cleared a space near the window, and they arranged the furniture carefully, pulling off the dust cloths and revealing the full beauty of his craftsmanship. Margaret folded the tiny quilts and laid them on the bed, their colors bright against the wood. When they stepped back to look at their work, John's eyes were wet, but his expression was peaceful. "Thank you," he said, "for understanding, for not trying to erase them." "John, I would never try to erase your family. They made you who you are. They are part of this place's story, and I am honored to help preserve it." Margaret touched his arm lightly. "You love deeply, and you have lost deeply. There is nothing to hide or be ashamed of." He covered her hand with his, the simple gesture of connection feeling more natural each time. "You are a remarkable woman, Margaret Vale." "Still Vale, Rowan?" she asked gently. John's thumb moved slowly over her knuckles, an unconscious caress. "Do you truly want to be here? Not because you traveled all this way, or because the advertisement said so, but because you want to." Margaret considered the question carefully. 3 days ago, she had stepped off a train to meet a silent stranger. Now, standing in this cabin with the storm still raging outside, looking at a man who was slowly, painfully, opening his heart after years of grief, she realized something surprising. "Yes," she said simply. "I want to be Margaret Rowan. I want to build a life here with you, whatever that may look like. I want to be your partner in truth, not just in need." John's hand tightened on hers. "Then when this storm clears and we can get to town, we'll see the Reverend. We'll make it official." He paused, then added with uncharacteristic vulnerability, "I can't promise I'll be easy to live with. I've grown used to silence and solitude. I'll likely frustrate you often." "And I will likely frustrate you too," Margaret countered. "I have opinions and I'm not always good at keeping them to myself. I rearrange things to suit me. I hum when I work, and I sometimes talk to myself when I'm thinking through a problem." "I like your humming," John said. "And your rearranging has already made this place feel more like a home than it has in 2 years. As for talking to yourself, at least it means someone in this cabin knows how to hold a conversation." Margaret laughed, a sound that surprised even her. "Are you making a joke about your own silence?" "Seemed about time," John replied, and there was genuine humor in his eyes. "Besides, you've been talking enough for the both of us. Figured I should at least acknowledge it." They stood there in the lamplight, hands clasped. The rocking horse and the little bed bore silent witness to the past as two people reached for a future. Outside, the storm began, at long last, to subside, and inside something new and fragile was taking root. Not a replacement for what was lost, but something entirely its own. The fourth morning brought a miracle. Silence. Margaret woke to no wind, no snow lashing against the windows, and for a moment she lay perfectly still, almost afraid to breathe lest the storm hear her and return with renewed vengeance. But the silence held, deep and complete, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth and John's footsteps in the main room. She dressed quickly and went out to find him standing by the window with a mug of coffee in his hand, gazing out at a transformed world. Sunlight, real, brilliant sunlight, streamed through the glass, turning the snow-covered landscape into a field of diamonds. The sky stretched blue and endless above them, so clear it almost hurt to look. "It's over," John said without turning. The storm had passed during the night. Margaret came to stand beside him, and the view stole her breath. Snow was everywhere, piled in enormous drifts the wind had sculpted into fantastical shapes. The path to the barn had vanished completely, buried under at least 3 feet of snow. The fence posts were barely visible, transformed into snow-capped sentinels. Everything was clean, pure, untouched. A blank page waiting to be written on. "It's beautiful," Margaret breathed. "It's deadly," John corrected, though there was no harshness in his voice. "All this beauty will kill you if you're not careful. The cold, the drifts, plenty of folk have died in weather like this, even after the storm has passed." He finally turned to look at her, his expression grave. "That's why we need to be smart about how we dig out. It'll take days to clear the paths properly." "Then we'd best get started," Margaret said practically. "After breakfast, of course. No sense in working on an empty stomach." They ate quickly, another meal of oatmeal with dried apples and a generous dollop of honey. John was preoccupied, his mind clearly turning over what needed to be done and in what order. Margaret let him be, understanding that he was shifting from storm survival mode to recovery mode, a different set of challenges, requiring different solutions. "We'll start with the path to the barn," John said, as they cleared away the breakfast dishes. "Animals come first, always. Then, I need to check the roof repairs in the daylight. Make sure everything's holding. After that, we need to dig out around the cabin. Make sure the doors can open properly. Clear the windows. The path to the woodshed is the next priority." "John," Margaret interrupted gently, "we have time. The storm is over. We don't have to do it all at once." He blinked, then gave a sad sort of smile. "Force of habit. When you work a farm alone, you learn to prioritize and move fast. It's a hard thing to set aside." "Well, you're not alone anymore," Margaret reminded him. "So we'll tackle it together, one task at a time." They bundled into their warmest clothes and stepped out into the reborn world. The cold hit them at once, sharp and clean, but without the wind, it was bearable. Almost pleasant, Margaret thought, if she didn't have hours of back-breaking labor ahead of her. John retrieved 2 snow shovels from the small lean-to attached to the cabin, handing one to Margaret. He demonstrated the proper technique, showing her how to lift with her legs instead of her back, how to pace herself to avoid exhaustion, and how to read the snow to find the most efficient path through the drifts. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," Margaret confirmed. They began to dig. Within minutes, Margaret understood why John had stressed the importance of pacing. The snow was heavy, sodden with its own weight, and each shovelful felt like lifting a stone. A dull ache started in her shoulders, then spread to her back, then her arms. Sweat dampened the dress beneath her heavy coat, despite the freezing temperature. She wanted to stop, to rest, but John kept on with a methodical efficiency, and her pride wouldn't let her give up before he did. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, John called for a break. "Rest," he said, leaning on his shovel. "You push too hard, you'll injure yourself." Margaret gratefully stopped, panting for breath. They had cleared maybe 20 feet of the path, leaving walls of snow on either side that were taller than her head. The barn still seemed impossibly distant. "How long will this take?" she asked. "The rest of the day, most likely. Maybe into tomorrow." John pulled out a canteen and took a long drink, then passed it to her. "Used to take me and Sarah 2 full days to dig out after a big one, even with Thomas helping. Course, he mostly just played in the snow piles, but still, it's slow work." They resumed their digging, falling into a rhythm. Dig, lift, toss, dig, lift, toss. Margaret's mind began to wander, thinking of Philadelphia, of how different her life would be if she had stayed. She would be in Mrs. Henderson's shop right now, bent over some society woman's wedding gown, her fingers aching from tiny stitches, breathing in the dust of the fabric, and listening to Mrs. Henderson criticize her work. Invisible, unnecessary, slowly fading into nothing. Here she was necessary. Every shovelful of snow she moved mattered. Every bit of help she gave John made a difference. Her muscles might ache, and her hands might blister, but she was real, solid, present in a way she hadn't been for years. "What are you smiling about?" John asked. Margaret hadn't realized she was. "Just thinking how I'd rather be doing this than sewing wedding dresses." John gave a short, surprised laugh. "Most women would think you'd lost your mind, choosing to shovel snow over indoor work." "Most women haven't spent 6 years sewing other people's dreams while their own died," Margaret replied. She drove her shovel into the snow with particular vigor. "This is hard work, but it's honest work, and it's mine." "Ours," John corrected her softly. "Ours," Margaret agreed, and the word was a warmth in her chest. By midday, they reached the barn. They were both exhausted, their faces flushed from the cold and the effort, but there was a deep satisfaction in looking back at the clean path stretching behind them. John heaved the barn door open, and they stepped into the familiar warmth of animal breath and hay. The horses nickered a greeting, clearly glad to see them. Clover mooed plaintively, her udder full. John immediately went about his chores, feeding the horses, breaking the ice in the water trough, and checking each animal carefully for any sign of distress from the cold. Margaret went to Duchess, the gentler of the two mares, and stroked her velvety nose. The horse leaned into the touch, starved for attention after days of confinement. "She likes you," John noted, watching them. "Duchess doesn't take to everyone so quick." "We understand each other," Margaret said, continuing to stroke the horse's neck. "We're both trying to find our place in a new world." John came to stand beside her, his hand joining hers on Duchess's neck. "You've found your place, Margaret. You're right where you're meant to be." She turned to look at him, surprised by the certainty in his voice. His face was serious, his blue eyes locked on hers. In that moment, Margaret felt something shift inside her. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was the possibility of love, the foundation upon which love could be built with time and care. "Thank you," she said softly, "for taking a chance on me." "I'm pretty sure you were the one taking the chance," John replied. "Traveling halfway across the country to marry a man you'd never met, who could barely write a decent letter. That takes more courage than anything I've ever done." "Or more desperation," Margaret countered with a wry smile. "Courage and desperation often look the same from the outside." John's hand covered hers completely, warm and calloused and solid. "Either way, I'm grateful you came." They stood like that for a long moment, the quiet breathing of the horses, and Clover's contented munching the only sounds. Then John cleared his throat and stepped back, returning to his work with an efficiency that suggested he was a little embarrassed by the moment of vulnerability. Margaret helped as best she could, learning the rhythm of the barn chores. Which buckets held which feed, how much hay each animal required, the proper way to milk Clover without getting kicked. John was a patient teacher, explaining things clearly, without condescension, correcting her mistakes gently. By the time they finished, Margaret felt she could handle the morning chores on her own, if she had to. Roof held, John announced after climbing up to inspect the patched section. The repairs are solid. I'll need to do a permanent job come spring, but for now, we're safe. That's a relief, Margaret said. I was worried it might have weakened overnight. Me too, John admitted. He climbed down, brushing snow from his coat. Ready to head back? We should get some food in us before we tackle the next round. The walk back along their cleared path was easier, though Margaret's legs trembled with exhaustion by the time they reached the cabin. John noticed her stumble and took her elbow, his grip steady and careful. You pushed yourself too hard, he said, concern clear in his voice. I'm fine, Margaret insisted, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. I just need to eat and rest a bit. John guided her to the rocking chair by the hearth and set about making lunch with a surprising efficiency. He reheated the leftover stew, sliced bread, and even made fresh tea, just the way she liked it. When he handed her a steaming bowl and a mug, she looked at him with gratitude. You don't have to wait on me, she protested weakly. You shoveled snow for hours without a single complaint. The least I can do is heat some stew. He settled into the other chair with his own bowl. Besides, Sarah taught me that marriage is about taking care of each other. Some days you do more, some days I do. It all evens out in the end. They ate in a comfortable silence, and Margaret felt the strength slowly return to her limbs. The food was hot and satisfying, the fire a pleasant warmth on her chapped, flushed face. She watched John as he ate, noticing the way his hair fell over his brow when he bent over his bowl, the small scar above his left eyebrow she hadn't seen before, the careful way he chewed, as if he'd learned long ago not to waste a single mouthful. Tell me about your parents, John said suddenly. You've mentioned them, but I don't really know about them. Margaret set her spoon down, surprised by the question, but pleased that he'd asked. My father was a farrier, like I said, Thomas Wally, from County Cork originally, though he came to America as a boy. He was a quiet man, like you, more at home with horses than with people. But he was kind, and he loved my mother fiercely. And your mother? Catherine O'Brien she was. Irish through and through, with an opinion on everything and the stubbornness to back it up. Margaret smiled at the memory. She ran the household with an iron fist in a lace glove. Nothing happened in our home without her knowing and approving. But she was warm too, generous to a fault. If anyone in the neighborhood needed help, she was the first one on the doorstep with a pot of soup or an offer to mend clothes. You're like her, John observed. The warmth and generosity, at least. I can't speak to the stubbornness yet. Oh, I have that too, Margaret assured him. Just wait until we disagree on something important. You'll see the Irish come out soon enough. A ghost of a smile touched John's lips. I'll keep that in mind. What happened to them? My father first. Kicked by a horse he was shoeing. Fractured his skull. He lingered for 3 days, and then he was gone. My mother. She was never the same after that. She tried to carry on, but her heart was broken. The next winter, she took a chill that went to pneumonia, and she didn't fight very hard to get well. I think she was ready to join him. Margaret's voice caught slightly. I was 23, and suddenly I was all alone in a city that had no use for an orphaned Irish girl with no dowry and no prospects. John reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. I'm sorry. To lose them both so close together, that's a hard thing. It was, Margaret admitted. It still is sometimes. I'll find myself wanting to tell my mother something, or ask my father for advice, and then I remember. She squeezed his hand. But I think they would be happy about my choice to come here. They wanted me to be settled, to be happy, to build a life. I hope I can help you build that life, John said quietly. I know I'm not much, just a quiet rancher with more ghosts than conversation. But I'll try to be what you need. You are already more than I hoped for, Margaret said, and she meant it. You're kind and you're honest, and you've shown me more respect in 4 days than most men in Philadelphia showed me in 6 years. That's enough, John. More than enough. They finished their lunch, holding hands, and when they rose to go back out, John didn't let go right away. Instead, he drew her gently to her feet and just stood there, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. What is it? She asked, suddenly self-conscious. Just thinking, John said, about how life surprises you sometimes. A stubborn Irish woman who doesn't know when to quit, Margaret teased, trying to lighten the suddenly intense moment. A partner, John corrected her. Someone to share the burden. Someone to make this place feel alive again. He released her hand slowly, as if reluctant to break the contact. Come on, we have more work to do. They spent the afternoon clearing the area around the cabin, carving paths to the woodshed and the small structure that served as a root cellar. The work was as grueling as the mornings, perhaps more so as their muscles were already weary, but they pushed on together. John was mindful of breaks, forcing Margaret to stop and rest, even when she wanted to continue. He was mindful of the blisters forming on her delicate hands, despite the gloves. When the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the snow in hues of rose and gold, they finally called it a day. The cabin sat in the center of the cleared paths, like a ship on a frozen sea, accessible and functional once more. It wasn't everything that needed to be done. The storm had created weeks of work, but it was enough for now. Inside, they collapsed into their respective chairs, too tired to even think of dinner immediately. Margaret pulled off her gloves and examined her hands, red and raw, with several blisters beginning to form despite John's caution. She flexed her fingers experimentally and winced. Let me see, John said, reaching for her hands. They're fine, Margaret. His tone was gentle but firm. Let me see. She surrendered her hands to him, and he examined them with the same careful attention she had given his own damaged hands days before. He retrieved the salve and bandages without her having to ask, tending to her blisters with a gentleness that was surprising for such large hands. You worked too hard today, he said, as he wrapped the dressings. I should have stopped you sooner. You couldn't have stopped me if you'd tried, Margaret replied. I'm not made of porcelain, John. I won't break from a little hard work. Even so, this is going to hurt for days. He finished his work and sat back. Tomorrow we rest. The rest of the digging can wait. He repeated himself, his voice firm. It can wait. You pushed yourself beyond reason today, and while I admire your spirit, I won't have you do permanent damage to yourself. Tomorrow, we rest. Let your hands heal. Margaret wanted to argue, but the throbbing in her palms suggested he might be right. Agreed, she conceded, but only if you promise to let me help with the barn chores. Deal. John stood and moved to the kitchen. Now you sit still and let me handle supper. You've earned a rest. He prepared a simple meal: potatoes fried with onions, fresh eggs from the barn, and thick slices of bread toasted on the stovetop. Margaret watched him work, appreciating the economic grace of his movements, the way he seemed to always know exactly where everything was. Despite the kitchen's small size, he moved like someone who had done this for years, which, of course, he had. When he set the plate in front of her, Margaret was surprised to realize she was famished. The day's labor had burned through all her energy, and she ate with a heartiness that would have scandalized the ladies back in Philadelphia, who always insisted a woman should eat like a bird. Good appetite, John noted with approval. Sarah used to say that farm work would make anyone eat like a field hand. She was right. Your Sarah was a wise woman, Margaret said between bites. She was. John's expression was thoughtful rather than pained. I think she would have liked you. She always said this place needed someone with grit and determination, someone who wouldn't give up at the first sign of hardship. You have both in spades. I hope I would have liked her too, Margaret said carefully, unsure how to navigate this conversation about the woman whose place she was slowly, inevitably, taking. John was silent for a moment, then spoke with an unusual frankness. You know what's strange? For the first time since they died, I can think about Sarah and Thomas without feeling like I'm drowning. It still hurts. It probably always will. But it's not the same crushing weight it used to be. He met Margaret's eyes across the table. That's because of you. Your presence here. The way you've honored their memory while still making this place your own. You've helped me start to heal, Margaret. I want you to know that. Margaret felt tears well in her eyes. I'm glad. That's all I wanted. To help. To be of use, to build something real. I never wanted to erase them or pretend they didn't exist. I know. That's what makes you special. John reached across the table and covered her bandaged hand with his. You have a generous heart, Margaret Vale. I'm a lucky man that you answered my advertisement. They finished their supper in a comfortable silence, and afterward, John insisted on washing up while Margaret sat by the fire. Her entire body ached in a way she'd never known. Muscles she didn't even know she possessed were announcing their existence with throbbing pains. But beneath the physical discomfort was a deep satisfaction. She had worked hard, accomplished something real, proven her worth. As darkness fell completely, John lit the lamps and settled into his chair with his veterinary manual. Margaret picked up her mending, but her bandaged hands made the delicate work difficult. After several frustrating attempts to thread the needle, she set it aside with a sigh. Trouble? John asked, looking up from his book. Just frustration. I'm used to doing things with my hands, and these bandages make everything clumsy. Then don't do anything that requires fine motor control, John suggested sensibly. Read a book, rest, let yourself heal. Margaret looked around the cabin and realized she hadn't yet explored John's small collection of books. She walked to the shelf beside the fireplace and perused the titles. There were the veterinary manuals he studied religiously, several agricultural texts on crop rotation and animal husbandry, a few well-read novels, and surprisingly, several volumes of poetry. You enjoy poetry? Margaret asked, picking up a collection. Sarah did, John answered. She used to read it aloud in the evenings. I didn't understand half of it, but I loved to listen to her voice, the way she'd get excited about certain phrases or images. He paused. I haven't read any since she passed. Couldn't bear it. Margaret carried the book back to her chair, turning the pages carefully with her bandaged fingers. Would you mind if I read a little out loud? John's expression flickered, with something like pain, or perhaps longing. Then he gave a slow nod. No, I think I'd like that. Margaret opened to a random page and began to read. The words flowed out over them, verses about nature and beauty, about loss and redemption, about the quiet strength found in simple things. Her voice was nothing like what Sarah's must have been, and she stumbled occasionally over an unfamiliar phrase. But John listened with his eyes closed, his face gradually relaxing. When she finished the poem, he opened his eyes. Thank you. That was... Thank you. Shall I read more? Please. She read for the next hour, moving from Wordsworth to Byron, then finding a collection of American poets she didn't recognize. John sat perfectly still in his chair, listening with an intensity that suggested he was hearing more than just the words, perhaps hearing echoes of nights past, of his wife's voice mingled with Margaret's, of a home that had once been filled with such moments. Finally, when Margaret's voice began to grow hoarse, John stirred. That's enough for tonight. You'll hurt your throat. Margaret closed the book and returned it to the shelf. When she turned back, John was standing, and there was something different in his expression, a softness, an openness she had never seen before. Margaret, he said, and then seemed to struggle for the right words. I think Sarah would be happy you're here, that you're helping me learn to live again. She wouldn't have wanted me to be alone forever. She must have loved you very much, Margaret said softly, to want your happiness even beyond her own life. She did, and I loved her. John took a step closer. I want to be honest with you about something. I don't know if I can love like that again. That kind of love, the kind Sarah and I had, I don't know if a person gets that twice in a lifetime. Margaret felt a pang in her chest, but she nodded. I understand. And I'm not asking for that, John. I'm asking for partnership, respect, companionship. If love comes, then it will be a gift. If it doesn't, then we'll build something else, something just as valuable. You deserve more than just partnership, John said, his voice rough. I deserve someone honest and kind, who sees me as a person instead of an inconvenience or a burden, Margaret corrected him. Someone who treats me as an equal partner. Someone who makes me feel real again. And you've given me exactly that in just 4 days, John. That's worth more than pretty words about love that might not mean anything. John looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his eyes. Then slowly, carefully, he reached out and tucked a stray lock of her hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered for a moment against her cheek, calloused and warm. You're remarkable, he said quietly. Truly remarkable. Margaret's heart hammered at the gentle touch. So are you. You just don't see it yet. They stood there in the lamplight, close enough that Margaret could see the flecks of gray in John's blue eyes, the fine lines around his mouth, the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. She thought he might kiss her. She hoped he would. But instead, he took a step back and cleared his throat. You should get some sleep. We'll rest tomorrow, but the day after, We need to start planning a trip into town. The storm must have hit there too, and we need to check on people. Besides, his smile was small but genuine. We have a parson to visit. I can't have you living here unmarried for much longer. It wouldn't be proper. Heaven forbid we be improper, Margaret teased gently. Good night, John. Good night, Margaret. She retreated to her room, her heart still beating faster than normal, her cheeks still warm where his fingers had touched. She changed into her nightgown and slid into bed, but sleep was a long time coming. Her mind replayed the day, the exhausting work, the growing ease between them, the moment by the fire when he had touched her face with such unexpected tenderness. She was falling in love with him, Margaret realized. Not in the desperate, all-consuming way of the novels she'd read, but in a slower, deeper, more real way. She was falling for his quiet strength, his careful kindness, his willingness to honor the past while reaching for a future. She was falling for the way he made her feel needed and important and seen. And maybe, just maybe, he was starting to fall for her too. In the loft above, John lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His hand still tingled faintly where he had touched Margaret's face, and he couldn't quite believe he had done it. For 2 years, he had shied away from any physical contact beyond what was necessary, terrified that any tenderness might shatter the fragile control he kept over his grief. But tonight, with Margaret, listening to her read poetry in the lamplight, he had felt something stir inside him, something he thought had been dead and buried with Sarah. It wasn't the same feeling he'd had for Sarah. That had been a young, passionate, overwhelming love, the kind that burned hot and bright. This was different, quieter, steadier. It was the difference between a wildfire and a hearth fire. Both were valuable. Both gave warmth. But one consumed everything in its path, while the other sustained and comforted. He could build a life with Margaret. He was already building one day by day, conversation by conversation, shared task by shared task. She fit here in ways he hadn't anticipated. She made the cabin feel like a home again, instead of a mausoleum. And more than that, she made him want to try again, to take the risk of loving, to open himself to the possibility of happiness. It terrified him. But for the first time in 2 years, John Rowan felt something other than grief. He felt hope. The morning arrived with a softer quality than the days before. Golden shafts of sunlight streamed through the windows, turning the frost patterns on the glass into intricate lace. Margaret woke slowly, luxuriously, her body grateful for the promised day of rest. Her hands still ached from the previous day's labor, but the pain had subsided to a manageable throb beneath John's careful dressings. She padded out of her room to find John already up, his back to her, standing at the stove. The aroma of coffee filled the small cabin, mingling with something sweet and yeasty that made her stomach rumble in spite of itself. "What are you making?" she asked, drawing closer. John turned, and she was struck again by how different he looked when he smiled. Younger, lighter, almost boyish, despite the silver in his hair. "Pancakes," he said. "Sarah's recipe. Figured if we're taking a day of rest, we might as well start it right." Margaret came to stand beside him, watching as he poured the batter onto the hot griddle with an easy, practiced skill. The pancakes bubbled and browned, and when he flipped them, they revealed a perfectly golden surface. "You're full of surprises," Margaret said. "A farmer who can cook. Had to learn after Sarah passed." It was that or starve. He slid 3 pancakes onto a plate and handed it to her, then poured more batter for himself. Besides, Sarah's the one who taught me. She used to say a man ought to know his way around a kitchen, that relying on others for every meal was a form of helplessness she wouldn't abide in a husband. I like her more every time you talk about her, Margaret said, carrying the plate to the table. John had already set out butter and a precious jar of maple syrup, luxuries that suggested he saved them for special occasions. They ate in a comfortable silence. The pancakes were light and perfectly sweet, the syrup adding a richness that made every bite feel like a celebration. Margaret found herself watching him between bites, noting the relaxed set of his shoulders, the absence of the haunted look that had shadowed his eyes when she'd first arrived. He caught her gaze and raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "Just thinking," Margaret said honestly. "How different you seem from the man who met me at the train station. Less like a mountain, and more like a person." John considered this, chewing slowly. "I feel different. Lighter somehow. Like I'd been carrying something heavy for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down. You helped me remember." "We helped each other," Margaret corrected gently. "I was drowning in my own way back in Philadelphia. This place, this life, it's given me air to breathe again." After breakfast, true to his word, John declared it a day of rest. He saw to the barn chores himself, waving off Margaret's offer to help, and returned with fresh milk and the news that the animals were all fine, despite the storm. The rest of the morning passed in quiet domesticity. John sat by the fire mending a leather harness, while Margaret, her hands still too tender for fine needlework, organized the pantry and made lists of supplies they would need when they could finally get to town. Around noon, John set his work aside and looked at Margaret, his expression a mixture of resolve and nervousness. "There's something I want to show you outside. You'll need your warm coat." A powerful wave of pressure seized her abdomen, stealing her breath. Marcus glanced at his watch. "That's one. Let's time them." He worked methodically, transforming a corner of the cabin into a birthing suite. Clean linens on the bed, medical instruments sterilizing in boiling water, makeshift stirrups fashioned from clean rope. Every movement was efficient, with no wasted energy, no hint of panic. Sarah watched him through waves of mounting discomfort. "You've really done this before?" "Twice in Afghanistan. Once in South Sudan." He positioned lanterns for the best possible light. "Not ideal conditions, but we managed." Another contraction hit her, harder than the first. Sarah breathed through it, drawing on the techniques from her birthing classes. Marcus noted the time. 12 minutes since the last. Still early. First babies usually take their time. He arranged pillows to support her back. "Try to rest between them. Conserve your strength." "What about those men outside?" Marcus's expression hardened for a moment. "That's a secondary concern. This cabin has stood for 40 years. It's solid. The entrance is defensible." The clinical assessment was strangely reassuring. Sarah nodded, then winced as another contraction began to build. 8 minutes, Marcus noted, a hint of surprise in his voice. Moving faster than expected. He went to the stove and returned with a cup of herbal tea. Red raspberry leaf. It helps with labor. Sarah took it gratefully. "Where did you have that stashed away?" "It's good for a number of medicinal purposes." A faint smile touched his lips. "Though I'll admit, obstetric supplies weren't my top priority when I scouted this place." The next few hours blurred into a haze of escalating contractions. Before Sarah's eyes, Marcus transformed, the gruff recluse replaced by a focused, competent physician. He checked her progress regularly, his clinical detachment making the intimate examinations less awkward than they might have been. 6 centimeters, he reported. Good progress. By evening, the contractions were coming every 3 minutes. Sarah gripped the edge of the bed, sweat matting her hair. I don't know if I can do this. You are doing it. Marcus's voice was firm, an anchor in the storm of pain. Your body knows what to do, trust it. A sound from outside drew his attention to the window. Dusk had fallen, and with it came the sound of movement in the undergrowth, too deliberate for wildlife. They're back, Sarah whispered. Marcus moved swiftly to the window, peering out cautiously. One man, on watch. He retrieved his rifle, positioning it nearby. Then he returned to Sarah, coaching her through another contraction, as if there had been no interruption. Deep breath. That's it. The contractions intensified again, now only a minute apart. A cry was torn from Sarah's throat, the sound impossible to contain. I need to push. Marcus examined her again. Not yet, almost. Breathe through the urge. The noise outside stopped abruptly. Marcus went still, listening. They heard you. I can't be quiet, Sarah gasped, as another contraction peaked. Don't try. He moved to position himself between the bed and the door, within reach of both Sarah and his weapon. Let them hear. It might even work in our favor. How? She managed to ask. Few things are more terrifying than a woman in labor, Marcus said, the faint smile returning. Even hardened men tend to keep their distance. As if in answer, the footsteps outside retreated toward the tree line. Marcus nodded in satisfaction. See? Tactical advantage. Sarah might have laughed if another contraction hadn't seized her. This one was different. An overwhelming, irresistible urge to bear down. Marcus, she gasped. It's time. He checked one last time, then nodded, all trace of humor gone. You're right. 10 centimeters. On the next one, you push. Outside, the darkness was complete. The watcher had retreated, but Marcus knew they hadn't gone far. Inside, a new life was about to begin. Two forces, creation and threat, converged on this small cabin in the middle of nowhere. Ready? Marcus asked, positioning himself. Sarah nodded, gathering her strength as the next wave began to build. Push, he instructed calmly. Bring your child into the world. The sound of shattering glass tore through the concentrated intensity of the room. Marcus whipped his head toward the back window, where a gloved hand was now reaching through a jagged hole, fumbling for the latch. Sarah, keep pushing, he commanded, his voice calm, belying the urgency of his movement as he surged toward the intruder. With remarkable strength, Marcus launched himself from his seat, seizing the intruding arm and twisting it sharply. A cry of pain erupted from outside as Marcus slammed the arm against the window frame, forcing the fingers to release a hunting knife that clattered to the floor. Sarah screamed with another contraction, her focus torn between her body and the struggle at the window. I'm here, Marcus called to her, maintaining his grip while reaching for the rifle with his free hand. Keep going. You're doing great. The intruder wrenched his arm free, disappearing from the broken window. Marcus quickly wedged a metal toolbox into the opening, then moved back to Sarah's side, rifle across his lap. That was impressive, Sarah panted. Combat training? He repositioned himself to assist, his eyes scanning every point of entry. Focus on pushing now. Muffled voices murmured outside. Several of them. The intruder hadn't come alone. How many? Sarah started to ask, but the question was lost as the world narrowed to the all-consuming need to push.